Yes, so we are here for the first plenary session. And I won't say much, but I would like to introduce the moderator who will come and then moderate this session. She's a very dear friend of mine, and I'm very happy to actually be introducing her to this panel. Her name is Louise Kanyonga. She's the head of strategy and competitiveness at Rwanda Development Board. Louise is she's in a government institution, Rwanda Development Board, that's in charge of accelerating economic growth and development of the country, where she is tasked with aligning strategic priorities with the national vision and driving interventions to enhance private sector competitiveness. Prior to that, Louise served as the Registrar General, also at Rwanda Development Board. She's a lawyer by training and specialized in commercial and corporate law, having attained her first degree in South Africa at the University of Witwatersrand and a Master's of Law at Harvard Law School. Louise, welcome to the stage. And please help me in welcoming Louise to the stage.
Thank you very much, Diana. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as Diana said, this is our first panel session for the conference for the day. Leading from that I think you'd all agree that was a fantastic conversation that we had with the President and Mr. Dilama. And what this session is going to be is really a continuation of that conversation. And what we hope to do is to tackle some of the pertinent issues in Africa's, context today as we're driving towards increased integration. How do we compete within this, new economy that's driven by innovation and fast-paced technological changes? And how do we chart some of the imperatives, the practical paths for us as a continent, to leverage on the opportunities that this new era presents and make sure that, structural transformation is happening across the continent. So as Diana said, I'm Louise. I'm with the Rwanda Development Board. I'm extremely honored to be moderating this session. We have an extremely esteemed panel of experts that are going to be leading this conversation. I had a session with them earlier this morning, and I can assure you all you're in for a treat. And I think that this is really going to add value to the conversation that you have. They all come from several fields that are very, pertinent to the issues that we're discussing, and they bring with them vast experience and expertise. So with that, allow me now to introduce our distinguished panelists. I will ask the panelists to please come up to the stage as I introduce you, and let's warmly welcome them as they make their way up. First, we have Mr. Samaila Zubairu. You're welcome to the stage. Thank you. So Mr. Zubairu is an Eisenhower Fellow himself. He's President and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation. He is also the Chairman of AfriCapital Management Limited, Director of West Africa Infrastructure Investment Managers. He is an accomplished infrastructure development finance specialist. I think you have close to 30 years of professional experience in the field. I think notably something to mention about Mr. Zubairu is that he served as the CFO at Dangote Cement, and in that role, he pioneered the launch of Africa's largest syndicated project finance facility for a local corporate. He sits on the Eisenhower Fellowship's Global Network Council, as well as the President's Advisory Council. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here for this conversation. Joining Mr. Zubairu is Ambassador Fatima Kyari Mohammed. Please join me in welcoming her as well. Clearly a fan favorite. Ambassador Fatima is the African Union, permanent representative to the UN. Before this, she served as the senior special advisor to the ECOWAS Commission, and she worked in that same organization, I believe, for over a decade in different capacities. She was also the executive director prior to joining ECOWAS at the West Africa Conflict and Security Consulting, which was a family of regional consulting companies that worked at the intersection of security, research, development, and investment in conflict-affected and fragile areas. It's great to have you here, Ambassador Fatima. Our next panelist is Dr. Nkosana Moyo. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome as well. Dr. Konsana is also an Eisenhower Fellow. He is the founder and executive chair of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, which is based in South Africa. He previously served as the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Africa Development Bank. Prior to joining the AFDB, he worked at Actis Capital as their managing partner for the Africa business. He's served on numerous boards in companies across several sectors, and he served as a minister for trade, for industry and international trade in the Republic of Zimbabwe. He is currently on the board of trustees of the Investment Climate Facility and the Africa Leadership Institute. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo, for joining us today. Joining the panel, we also have Mr. Kimball Chen. If you could also join me in giving him a warm welcome. Thank you. Mr. Kimball Chen has more than 40 years experience as a leader in the LNG and LPG energy sectors. He's served within these sectors in various capacities, ranging from CEO, investor, senior advisor to governments and international organizations. He's also a former president of the World LPG Association. He's a member of the International Chamber of Commerce, G20 CEO Advisory Group, and in that capacity, he lends a lot of energy and infrastructure policy insights to contribute towards the global debate. As was mentioned earlier, he sits on the Board of Trustees of the Eisenhower Fellowships and also the Board of Trustees at Gordon School. So thank you very much, Mr. Chen, for joining us. And finally, we have Jita Dharmaratnam. I hope I got that right. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome as well. Thank you. So Jita is an Eisenhower Fellow as well. She's partner, Africa, and head of impact for LGT Impact, a global impact investment fund. She is a seasoned private equity professional. She has over 19 years of experience in developing markets, investing in Africa, impact investment, global insurance, reinsurance. And she actually herself was a founding partner of T5 Africa Capital Partners, which is a private equity fund that was very focused on investing in growing mid-cap businesses in sub-Saharan Africa. She also was a principal at Aureus Capital, which is really probably the global leading SME private equity firm. And in that role, she developed the first private equity sustainability index. So thank you very much for being here, Jita. And thank you all for being part of this conversation. So I think you can see from the people that we have on this panel that this is going to be a very rich conversation. And I think we can just head straight into our conversation. And I say really leading from the great perspectives that we had from His Excellency earlier today. And I want to start with you, Ambassador Fatima, because Africa's integration is very central. It's a very central, very pivotal theme to everything that we're discussing here. And I think the president he said it perfectly, that this is something that I think all African governments are aligned on the premise that regional integration is key. We've been aligned on that premise for quite some time now. From even before the AU, all the predecessors to the AU were very centered around regional integration as a lever for growth. But despite this, and as the president said, our record, our track record on integration has not been very impressive. And, the political will that we often see expressed is not necessarily translated into action. We still have very low intra-African trade. We've got, complicated customs procedures that make it difficult for people to move across the region. And as we'll be discussing later, issues of, infrastructure, connecting Africa, within and to the rest of the world. Now, even though we're seeing a lot of, revival in the impetus for integration with the AU 2063 agenda, the AFCFTA, the question I'd like to put to you is, given the past trends that we've had regarding integration on our continent, What are your perspectives on how we can learn from our mistakes and make sure that this time around we're sustaining the momentum that we're enjoying at the moment with initiatives such as the AFC FTA, and really making sure that we're leveraging these initiatives for real and structural transformation across the continent?
Thank you. Is this on? No. Thank you so much, Louise. And I'm also, very happy to be here, particularly as an Eisenhower Fellow, right? Once a fellow, always a fellow. And before I go to your question, I'd also like to just give a shout out again to the Africa Fellows for putting this historic event together. And in particular, the Rwandan Fellows, I know a lot of work was put into this. So congratulations, and really I'm very proud to be here. I think to go to your question regarding some of the objectives that President Kagame highlighted earlier, I think the difference this time around is about collective engagement, but also collective benefits, right? When the AU was set up, or at that time it was the Organization of African Unity, over 50 years ago, the focus was a bit different. It was more about independence, liberalization, ensuring that our countries are able to move forward and move away from, the colonial chains. After that, in 2002, when we reformed into the African Union, the focus changed, and it was more about regional integration and developing Africa from within. And this is kind of what informed the setting up of the Agenda 2063, which is Africa's development agenda, but also the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I'd like to just maybe provide some context, particularly for those that are not, very familiar with the Continental Free Trade Area. And just before going there as well, I'd like to also pass, the apologies to the from Commissioner Muchanga, for whom I'm sitting in today, and who had to cancel at the last minute because he had to be in DC for some other meetings. So the Continental Free Trade Agreement basically is one of our flagship programs that focuses on implementing the first 10-year implementation program of our development agenda. And its objective basically is that this time around, there should be a people-centered development free trade area that goes beyond tariff liberalization, but which also increases the choice of the variables for the African people. As at now, I heard different figures earlier, even from the president himself, but the current figures are that we have 52 signatories to the agreement. So only 3 countries have not signed, and that's Nigeria, Benin, and Eritrea. As far as Nigeria is concerned, I can say a bit about that. I know that currently internally, and maybe you can say a little more about that, Samaila, that there are internal discussions going on. There was a committee that has been established towards its signing of the agreement. We currently have 24 ratifications. We only needed 22 for it to enter into force, so there's still 31 remaining. And so it officially entered into force on 30th of May this year. And in July this year, as the President mentioned earlier, we're officially going to launch this in Niamey. So basically, technically, this basically means that we as Africa are establishing the largest free trade area in the world since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. And of course, implementation will be gradual because countries are continuously negotiating the various tariff schedules, rules of origin, and commitments for service sectors. What it will do, basically, is to create an integrated and competitive market for the 1.2 billion people currently on the continent, with an aggregated GDP of $3.4 trillion. In addition, it'll help us create policy space for industrialization, economic structural transformation, regional integration, etc. And of course, earlier we discussed a little bit about, the thriving cross-border informal trade, in a wide range of areas, processed foods, drinks, various commodities. But it's very much about formalizing the informal sector and ensuring that we are able to increase our global trade from the current 3% to 6% within a decade, which is the global share that Africa has had since 1964. But that said, a lot of it, because a lot of it is informal, a lot of these numbers are actually not captured. So it's really about being able to capture these numbers formally, creating structures and putting in policies in place that allow us to focus more on internal trade, and for us to be able to be stronger to trade with our partners outside of the continent.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, drawing from the canvas that she's led in terms of what the benefits and the prospects that initiatives like the AFCFTA have, I just want to turn to you, Dr. Moyo, maybe to just really talk about what it will take for us to get there, and this really against the backdrop that one, we're in a shifting global space, driven by technology innovation. But also that, again, as a continent, we've seen, very unprecedented high growth. We still remain one of the fastest growing regions in the world. But that growth is also starting to slow down. And questions are now turning to the quality, of that growth, particularly in terms of inclusiveness, job creation, innovation, adoption, and so on. And you've also seen, from most international organizations that, the forecasts for Africa's growth are also starting to be revised downwards. And so obviously it lends to the question of, the sustainability of that growth. And also just looking at the fact that for a long time, Africa has been left behind, with all the previous global shifts that we've had. And so the question that I would like you to respond to is, and particularly in your role at the Mines Institute, is, what can we do as African countries to do two things? One is to fashion meaningful policy actions that can ensure that this time we have real and inclusive transformation, but importantly, make sure that there's delivery, on those actions. And what's the role of institutes such as the one that you chair in that space of policy formulation, but also accountability to governments and leaders for delivery?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me start by echoing the ambassador's sentiments about this event and congratulate the Eisenhower Fellows of Rwanda for putting up such a good show, and I'm sure that a lot of work went into making it happen. Having said that, I am always troubled by events such as conferences to discuss the African situation. And the reason why it causes me a lot of anxiety is that more often than not, I don't think we have honest conversations. We are desperate, I think, to try to paint a positive picture of where we are headed and why we should be optimistic and so on and so on. And in the process, we then fail to do a proper diagnostic of why in the past we failed. And we seem to have this enthusiasm and a thirst for writing more and more new pieces of paper. Whereas if we took the pieces of paper we have already and implemented them, so I'll use my country, and my country is more broken than most others. If Zimbabwe today stopped writing any new legislation, any new plans, and implemented the constitution it has today, Zimbabwe would be a beautiful country. Beautiful country. So if you ask me, all of these questions, what are they predicated on in terms of what is the ingredient, the single most important ingredient which is required for us to succeed? And how do we get to that point to get this fixed in terms of prioritization and sequencing? We would have to find almost like a magical wand for how to select leaders. It is the only conversation we should be having. How do we get on this continent leaders like Paul Kagame, who don't just talk, but implement and lead from the front? We can duck and dive as much as we like. I actually think that all this effort, until we solve that one question, is going to amount to nothing. That's my view. So policies, we've got aplenty. We've got them drawers overrunning with paper. The question is delivery. What is it that has happened to stop us delivering? I can hazard a few observations which I suspect will be controversial in some respects. My observation, especially in the work that we've done in mines, is that a lot of us are not even aware of how damaged we as a people are. And I want for you to hear me through, don't get emotional, try to be scientific about this. Try to be, so cause and effect. We came from a place where our space was not ours. We were not given ownership, or we didn't demand ownership, however you want to frame it. And what has happened with a lot of African countries is that we, in theory, have become independent and own the agenda of what happens in our space. But when you look at our behavior, our mentality still has got a negative orientation towards taking responsibility for what happens in this space. So let me give an example. If you look at most African countries and their relationship towards wealth creation and partnership with the private sector, most African countries still treat the private sector as an enemy. But we need to understand where that comes from. Before independence, it was legitimate to consider the private sector as an enemy because it was partnering with the colonial forces. So fighting colonization included trying to undermine the private sector. At the transition point where we should have changed our mentality, we didn't do this. We continued to behave as if, in fact, the private sector is not to be trusted. It's not a partner, it's an enemy. I use that single example to say, until we have a more honest, inward-looking diagnostic of who are we, what journey have we traveled, and what damage has happened which we need to repair, we are not going to get very far. That would be my submission. I know a lot of people find this conversation, when it's framed this way, very uncomfortable. But when I look at where we are and what we've done or not done, I keep coming back to the same issue. We have not yet owned up to dealing with the damage that's happened. Maybe let me give you one more illustration to make my point. If I look at the issue of violence in South Africa, we can call it violence against women, whatever facet you choose to look at. That violence in that society comes from a historical fact. But history is history, it's fact, it's happened. So you should not use history as a reason to condone what is happening. You should use history as a basis for understanding how to now structure a solution for what is there. Until South Africa understands the violent nature of its society and where that came from, they will not be able to put in place a solution to deal with it over an extended time to undo that violence. Yeah? So we need to understand our history, absolutely no question. But we need to own it and use it as a scientific fact and then say, like a disease, I've got a disease, wherever it came from. What is important is that I identify it correctly in order to then do the prescription correctly. We are failing to do that.
Very, very interesting perspectives, seeing the scientist in you coming out, Nkosana, and I think, resonates a lot with what we heard earlier, specifically as a message to the youth to understand our history before we can start, to think of how do we contribute, but also, this idea of moving from political rhetoric to action and really holding our leaders accountable to that. Now, leading from, some of these very broad themes and imperatives for success, if we want to really position Africa as, a global player, a serious global player to contend with, I want us to transition and look at some of the more concrete, actions and challenges as well. And for this, I want to come to you, Samaila, to talk about, an issue that arguably is the cornerstone, for Africa's integration and transformation, and that is infrastructural development. I think, you could really say that this could be the divide between success and failure, for Africa's integration regionally, but also to the rest of the world, as the president said earlier. And we all know, I think everyone in the room knows that we have an infrastructure challenge as a continent. It has very serious ramifications in terms of trade, in terms of optimizing the benefits of innovation that are driven by connectivity, and also, limits our potential to fully exploit our manufacturing capabilities. Now, I think it's also very clear that most African countries understand the central importance of developing their infrastructure. The key constraint they face, if you speak to most of them, is going to be how do we finance that infrastructure, given the very peculiar nature of the sector. It's estimated that the continent's infrastructure needs are about 130 to 170 billion a year, and we have a gap of, in terms of financing, that goes, up to 100 billion. And so this is a very serious issue. So I wanted you to speak from your vantage point specifically at the Africa Finance Corporation, which really has outlined its mission, as being an institution that comes in and bridges that infrastructure deficit. What do you think, some of the innovative solutions African governments can pursue to fund that critical infrastructure gap? And also, how, do African countries put in place the right, the enabling environment, the right policies and structures to fully optimize and benefit from those innovative financing solutions?
Thank you. Like my other colleagues, I will start by congratulating Eisenhower Fellowships. First, for its creation, for giving us the opportunity to be leaders and the opportunity to take charge of the challenges and opportunities within our environment. So this conference is speaking to that. We have understood the need for leaders in Africa. We understand that a society can only benefit when it has, I would say, educated, thoughtful leaders that take ownership. So the Eisenhower Fellowship has empowered us to take ownership, to be change agents, and to find ways to improve our societies. So this conference speaks to what we're doing on the continent to create the leaders that, we don't need magic wand for leaders. We have to create the leaders. Eisenhower Fellowship has created leaders. We'll continue to create leaders. Eventually, some of us will rise to the position of leading the society. I'm very optimistic about Ghana. We have one of our Eisenhower Fellows there that, from his interview, said he was going to be the president of Ghana. And he said why he was going to be the president of Ghana. So we look forward to people like that leading the charge. Again, thanks to the Eisenhower Fellowship, thanks to the EF community in Rwanda for doing this. We all appreciate this, and we thank you. Back to the question, I think I will start by saying that the infrastructure deficit or investment requirement on the continent is quite significant. It's actually $170 billion. If you look more deeply, you would see that there's a need for $67 billion in water and sanitation. There's a need for $50 billion investment in energy. There's a need for $47 billion investment in transport and logistics, and about $7 billion in ICT. ICT the least because of all the revolution that's happened in GSM, and the massive investment has happened in that space. So that's why there isn't much to do there. And if you look at how Africa has come to this challenge, it has come mainly with African government themselves making most of the investments. So on average, we invest about $77 billion in infrastructure. over the last 6-7 years on average. Some years it goes to 80, but some years down to 60. Well, on average, about 77 billion. And most of that comes from the government, African governments. The next big contributor is the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, which comprises groups like the G8, development finance institutions like ourselves, World Bank, and several other groups. Then we have China, or China Inc., contributing almost 23% in that space. And then we have Middle Eastern and Asian investors also coming in. So the big deficit is about $93 billion annually. And that deficit exists because we are not able to mobilize private capital into this space. It happens, but not on the scale that we expect for us to be able to move the dial. So AFC was actually created to solve this challenge. We were created in 2007 by an agreement among sovereign African states to find an institution, create a multilateral financial institution that would focus on providing solutions to Africa's infrastructure deficit and challenging business environment by developing and financing infrastructure assets, natural resource assets, and industrial assets with a view to enhancing productivity and economic growth of African states. If you talk to most bankers, they will tell you that they have funding, but there are no projects, which is why our charge is how do we create those bankable projects? Because we were speaking earlier in the day that there is no African way. There's just a way of doing things, and that way requires a risk management framework to be in place for you to be able to attract capital. And once you can create that management framework, capital will follow. So the big charge at AFC is how can we accelerate the creation of these bankable projects? And we do that by first working on our minds as Africans. We have to take ownership that this challenge is ours, and we're the ones that will have to resolve it. There is nobody coming to solve these problems. We must solve these problems. So we should look at how business is done and see how we can tweak it to our particular circumstance. One of the things we've done is so most people tell you that we want you to come to us with a bankable project, but nobody is going to invest in creating that bankable project. So we have stepped in to put together a facility to create bankable projects. So once we meet a sponsor or an African government that has an idea, we would match them with our capital. But we have defined the areas in which we intervene because we're trying to be impactful. So we're intervening in energy, we're intervening in transport and logistics, we're intervening in natural resources, we're intervening in telecoms and heavy industry. So we have done a couple of, I would say, projects that are landmark. We did the first wind farm in Cape Verde, providing 20% of the energy requirements of the state. We just commissioned a power plant in Ghana, 300 megawatts. It took almost 7 years in development. We joined the developers. We were able to, in 4 years, complete the project. The project had its challenges, but I always tell my colleagues and my directors and investors that it allowed us to prove that there's only one way to do it, because we put in place a framework, typically hoping that nothing goes wrong. But things do go wrong. So if they go wrong, you need to have a framework to deal with them. In this project, we had to sack the contractor because he was not delivering the project. But we had a framework to sack the contractor, so we sacked him. We called on all the guarantees. He took us to court, but because they were well structured, they eventually paid us. We had to step in to complete the plant because we had put in place an operations and management framework that allowed us to step in, and we did. So last Monday, we commissioned the plant. So we've done several other projects. We've invested $5.5 billion across 28 African countries, and we continue to find opportunities to meet capital. Now, one of the things that we do differently to be able to bridge this financing gap is that we look at the structure as we all know it and try to see how we can enhance it. So typically, you would wait for all the project's documents to be in place, all the permits to be in place before you achieve financial close. What we've done is to say, okay, look, we can put in place a construction finance facility. We can put in place an equity bridge. So we, as sponsors, together with our partners, would construct the project once we find it viable and we get most of what we need. We would undertake the construction. And once it's done, then we would invite our typical financial institutions. At that point, it is de-risked, and then they can come in. So we do that to try to get more projects over the line, and we do that to be able to attract institutional capital, which is the private capital that we need to get into the space. Now, we are also looking at how we can work with African governments to create swap programs that allows us lend in local currency. Now, most of the countries or the projects are locally available, and you have to use local currency to pay for them. Now, that increases currency risk because anytime there's a currency mismatch or there's volatility in oil prices, we have an event. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, we moved from $160 naira to $1 to 360. So that's like almost doubling. So we find that in most other commodity-dependent nations. So to be able to manage that risk, we need to find a way to get local currency to fund projects. So we work with governments. We put in place a swap program for that to happen. Then we've also created an infrastructure guarantee company that will guarantee, I would say, payment to pension funds and insurance companies that have the liquidity, have the capital, but can't take the risk without guarantees because it's pensions. So we have a framework to provide guarantees to them so that they can invest in bonds that are rated. We are also looking at specifically at projects that integrate the continent. So the World Bank tells us that international trade in Africa is at 10%. Other people say it's at 18%, but it's still the lowest in the globe. In the EU, we have about 70%. In Asia, we have about 60%. But in Africa, it's still low. I mean, it's very practical in Africa because a company that operates in Nigeria produces a product, can't export that product to Benin or to Cameroon. And these are all neighboring countries. There is no significant, no significant container traffic or I would say ships to move goods as well. So the lack of infrastructure doesn't allow us to trade. It is cheaper to import from Taiwan and China into Cameroon and Benin than it is to move from Nigeria into Cameroon and Benin. This is a practical reality that has to be solved before we can have continental free trade. So we are looking at how can we find projects that would integrate Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and eventually from Cote d'Ivoire to Senegal. It is in financing these projects that we would create, I would say, the environment and the framework for continental free trade to happen. With relation to governments, governments need to be pragmatic and they need to accept that capital is shy. Capital is always shy. They will always go to places where there is low risk. So it is our job as Africans to reduce the risk. And we do that by taking a long view. For example, we know that electricity is one of those areas where the more electricity you have, the cheaper it is. So what we need to do is to make the investment that allows us to get to that point where it will be cheap. We can't be saying that we are not going to give government guarantees. We can't be saying that we're going to increase public debt if we do that. We must take the view that if, for example, we're able to move to 12,000 megawatts, at that point in time, the tariff will not be so high. So we must motivate people today to make the investments that will get us to 12,000 megawatts. And we do that by simply providing predictable regulatory framework. If we say something, we must do it. We can't, because of elections, change what we say. We can't, because we're looking at just a 4-year window for elections, take decisions that don't consider the long view. We must separate those decisions that we will take for the long-term sustainability of our continent from those that we need to take tactically to win elections. So that is something that African leaders need to focus on. And once that is in place, the capital will flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of insights there. I think, the panelists that will be coming next will unpack particularly issues around, capital and what's hindering the flow of that capital. I'm sure, Geetha, that's something that you really will speak to. But just drawing, I think, Samaila mentioned towards the end, issues around energy. And this is something that I want to put to you, Mr. Kimball, which is, similar to infrastructure, we have a serious energy challenge on the continent. The numbers, again, are also quite dismal here. Of the 1.2 billion people that are in Africa, it's estimated that over 600 million of those have no, access to energy. If you look at rates of consumption on the continent relative to the rest of the world, just to give you a sense, the larger economies like Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, the per capita consumption is less than a tenth that of Brazil or China. Inevitably, this is going to significantly diminish our potential as a continent. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of shifts globally towards cleaner energies. I think it's now, very clear that the traditional energy sources, fossil fuels, are having a very adverse impact on climate change. And so there is this, transition towards more renewable energies and low carbon technologies. And so what I would like you to address is, Africa obviously seems to present a very natural advantage, in this shifting global space with, the unexploited potential that we have for renewable energy. So how do we take advantage of those trends? How do we move towards cleaner energy, but particularly becoming a significant global player in that space? And how do we also shape bold solutions, again, in the context of regional cooperation, that are going to address, the power gap in Africa? And I think it will also be important if we could speak to how African governments balance the dual challenge that we have of, yes, we need to increase installed capacities, energy generation, but we also need to ensure universal access, and that brings along different dynamics. So if you could just, address, I know there's a lot in there, but I think you bring a lot of insight to that.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. And before I try to answer them briefly, I'd like to also add my thanks to all the fellows and the organizers for this conference, because as the one non-African on this panel, I would like to say that I think one of the biggest operational challenges Africa has is to make its situation, both the good and the transitionally less functional, and the potential. You need to educate the outside world better. I know in my country, the United States, there's actually very little knowledge amongst even major decision makers about issues in Africa, what Africa's potential is, and what's the best way to cooperate and be a partner with Africa. So I hope that all of you take to heart the need to have good communications of African ideas to the rest of the world. So I'm telling you, you have to be outgoing as well as among yourselves. Even though this conversation is about intra-African trade and some of the issues around it, inevitably, in order for intra-African trade to create prosperity which will allow you to trade as a bloc with the non-African world, you're going to have a long-term joint shared program of communication with the rest of the world and prepare. So let me come to the energy question. Energy is a complicated subject. Many of you will recall that when the original set of so-called development goals, the Millennium Development Goals, were established 20 years ago as a means of trying to summarize what the world community should focus on in terms of partnership with the developing world, they left energy out of the list. That's like saying, I'm going to send people to the moon, but for political reasons, we're not going to discuss whether they should have oxygen in the spaceship. Energy is a prerequisite for development. It's a prerequisite for industrial development, and it's a prerequisite for social development and taking care of your citizens. So the issue that governments have to address is, what is the right form of energy for each type of use that energy has in an economy, and what is the long-term trajectory of the energy sector and the various things that you could emphasize or the projects you could do. Let me give you an example of what happens of unintended consequences of planning which didn't take into account as broadly what they should have taken into account. So my office received a call from the Ministry of Energy in South Africa. They had a problem, rolling blackouts and brownouts. I'm sure our South African colleagues in the room are familiar with this issue. That was an unintended consequence of trying to get everybody, especially in cities, to cook with electricity. What it did was create a peak load problem, and to handle a peak load, you have to have standby generating capacity, and that's expensive because standby is only used for the peak, and then it's idle during the rest of the day. So what happened was the South African government asked my NGO, which is the UN's arm, so to speak, for developing LPG sector development across the developing world, asked what can be done to move South Africa back to an energy supply concept which would be appropriate energy for the appropriate use. Electricity for lighting and industrial use, very important things, but cooking, LPG, which wouldn't impose create a problem and inefficiency and overspending and investment in the electricity sector. In France, for instance, a developed country, which has nuclear power and everything, people don't realize that if French population stopped cooking with gas, bottled gas, especially in the rural areas, they'd have to build 10 new nuclear stations. So the issue of energy is about what choices for what purposes, and at what stage should investments be made, and what are the other factors that influence those investments and the risks associated with those investments. So let me talk about risk for a moment, because Mr. Zubairu commented about de-risking. So when you talk about regional cooperation, cross-border cooperation, for instance, hydroelectric in one country, but about markets and long-term contracts in another, you worry about things like legal stability of regimes and tariff agreements and so forth. So you have to worry about stability of agreements. You have to worry about risks like climate risks. What happens if everybody pins their hope on a big hydroelectric plant and then because of climate change, the water supply dries up? What's your alternate strategy and standby strategy in case that starts to happen faster than expected? Because it takes a long time to build energy supply. Electricity, as a continent-wide ambition, will take trillions of dollars over 30 years. So what do you do in the meantime? So you have transition issues. Then you have political issues. The developed world and a lot of the donor agencies are against developing countries developing use of fossil fuel. They say, let's have renewable and green solutions now. The problem is that without robustness of technical solutions and business models and de-risking, you can have premature investment in technologies which don't work and supply chains which don't work. So the issue of technology and green and carbon reduction is intimately bound up with risk control, medium-term choices, and also what I would call transition goal setting. So for the Sustainable Development Goals of the international community, 2030 is an important evaluation point. So between now and 2030, everybody's focused on what can we demonstrate. For instance, the goal that my organization was set by the International Energy Agency was transition 1 billion people from burning wood and charcoal and dung to bottled gas. That was their estimate of the portion of the 2.7 billion people who do unclean cooking, what could be reasonably achieved by 2030. Well, it's now 2019. So basically, I have 11 years to collaborate with governments on trying to help them achieve their goals of clean cooking, which is a health issue, a deforestation issue, and so forth. So, and yet, let's come to my colleague Nkosana's point, and the points that all of you have been made. Governments and peoples have to take ownership of problems. That means that you yourselves have to define the problem, agree on the definition of the problem, and agree on the path to a solution, and then implementation. If you require regional cooperation to do that, that adds another layer of complexity because there has to be a critical mass of of agreed cooperation and change in each country subject to the cooperation in order for it to be de-risked and financeable. So cross-border pipelines or hydroelectric cross borders or oil supply, even things like road transport for fuel products. Are the road standards the same so that a truck, a lorry carrying LPG from Dar es Salaam can get to Rwanda without having to be transshipped because the road suddenly had a different load limit on it? Or railway gauges, standardizing them, or safety standards, so you could have, so all the equipment could be sold, same equipment could be used across major regions. So you have so many challenges just in the energy market about what should a nation decide, how should they decide, and let me not also forget to emphasize that policy and regulation, great, intelligent definition of problems, having the policies and regulations to solve those problems are great, but enforcement is an important and inevitable and necessary part of implementation. If you can't enforce safety standards, if you can't enforce compliance and payment, if you don't have property rights harmonization across borders and even within regions, you won't be able to accomplish anything. So I've just listed a whole, let me do one last thing, the green thing. The rate at which you can go green will depend on the rate at which technology actually becomes viable. What do I mean by viable? Viable economically and viable in terms of actual implementation in a robust manner. It's not enough to have a stove. You need to have fuel for the stove. There's a supply chain and the logistics chain for that there. There's a whole ecosystem of issues associated with energy or any other major problem. And so interministerial coordination is required by every government, cross-border cooperation is required, and understanding the consequences of making decisions is required. So I would just say that green is an individual country commitment, but may have implications in terms of competitiveness, and you're going to have to deal with that. So green is a goal, it's a worthy goal. What do you do in transition, especially between now and 2030? Do you have some use of fossil fuels with the intention to go to green when it becomes robust and financially available and viable? Let me stop, sorry.
Yeah, obviously a very, very complicated and nuanced topic. But I think the same themes emerge from what you're saying, which is we do know what needs to be done. I think it's really about just making smart investments, transitioning at the right time, and as Samaila and Kosana said, just getting things done. Manage risks along the way, but start to get things done. Now, I want to turn to you, Geetha, because I think from what everyone's been saying, be it from Kosana who talked about the relationship between governments and private sector, Samaila's interventions on financing and for growth, energy, infrastructure, and the kind of issues that Africa has attracting private capital. I think, again, here, this is something that we all know. We all know that Africa's growth, Africa's transformation is really going to be financed predominantly by, the private sector. It's the only way that we're going to make sure that we have inclusive growth, we have sustainable growth, we have resilient, socioeconomic change. Now, knowing that the private sector is going to be the stimulant for this, again, if you speak to African governments, one of the key things they'll tell you is how do we finance investments, and particularly given the unique landscape of Africa, even in Rwanda here, over 99% of our farms are probably SMEs. The kind of financial ecosystems that we have are just simply not aligned, to the needs of these SMEs oftentimes. And so the question that I would like to put to you is also, unpacking a few issues. And I think would really draw from your experience, as you said, investing in the region and in other emerging markets. What should African countries, and importantly African businesses as well, have in place as essential building blocks to make sure that we're attracting the right kinds of capital that will create positive impact, and lead to scale of our businesses. And also, I think it would be important to hear your perspective within the private sector on initiatives such as the AFCFTA. Do you see these initiatives driving impactful investments into the region and also in scaling African businesses?
Thank you. It's a pleasure and really a privilege to be here. And a number of the questions that you're asking me, I explored during my own fellowship in 2015. There were two things I was focused on during that fellowship, and I think they're relevant and pertinent for the conversation we're having today. The first of which is how can we get greater levels of financing into SMEs on the continent? And the second of which is a point that I've not yet heard brought up today, but I'm sure will be brought up more over the course of the next 2 days. And that is how do we become more inclusive from a gender perspective? So those are the 2 points I'd like to actually address today. To Nkosana's point, if we can't have uncomfortable conversations, honest conversations as Eisenhower fellows, then we're not in the right place. So with that, I'll start with what I think is a very broken model we have in the private sector, and that's the industry I've been in, which is private equity investing in the continent. Between 2013 and 2018, $17.8 billion was raised to invest in private equity in sub-Saharan Africa. $17.8 billion. Today, the ECA estimates that we need $66 billion a year to go into healthcare investment. The numbers we talk about, the need that we talk about, these numbers are huge. But in reality, a fraction of this is actually being raised to come into private equity investing. And the bulk of the investments we're making on the continent are in private businesses, because many of our companies have not reached the scale to justify being on one of the 16 stock exchanges that we have across the continent. Now, during this same time period, 2013 to 2018, there were about 1,022 transactions which were done. There were 273 exits. Capital is flowing to where risk, as Samaila was saying, is low, which means that we're seeing this pattern of the same businesses, the more established businesses, getting capital again and again and again. Whereas if we take a step back and reframe what it is we're trying to solve for, we're trying to solve for the provision of capital to create depth within our economies, for these businesses to be productive agents, to be hiring people, to be providing essential goods and services, first and foremost for the people who are living here in the continent. The town that I grew up in Botswana, at 11, I needed glasses. There was a traveling optometrist who would come twice a year to our town, twice a year. And that is Botswana, where GDP per capita is pretty high, right? Yet during this time period, 2013 to 2018, only 3% of the transactions that were done went into healthcare. In Africa, we have, 17% of the world's population, 26% of the disease burden, and only 3% of the capital that we have been deploying as a private equity industry has gone into healthcare. And this is during a time when we see a shift in the disease burden, which we're experiencing everywhere in the world, where we're moving towards more non-communicable diseases, which means that the cost of healthcare within each of our individual wallets going forward is increasing in a different way, because we're not trying to cure a disease, we're trying to manage a disease, often during our entire lifetime. So the kind of capital that's coming through the private sector, through private equity specifically, and that covers venture capital as well on the continent, is insufficient for what the needs are. A very clear solution is we need to unlock capital from the continent. I'm waiting for the day where capital will flow easily. That day certainly hasn't come, and I know there are enough people in this room who have been trying to raise capital for their own investments to recognize that. Until that time, what makes a fundamental difference is if we can get our own pension funds to start making allocations to fund the growth that we need in our countries. Because of the risk frameworks that are currently in place, most of these pension funds are investing in treasury bonds off the continent for a very, very low return, but the risk is more manageable. To be able to start to transition some of that capital into this industry is going to be transformative, especially in terms of financing small and medium-sized businesses. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when I talk about the private equity model being quite fundamentally flawed, we work with a 10-year lifespan. 5 years to invest, 5 years to divest and return capital to investors. Right now, on average, it's taking 4 years for a fund to be raised in Africa. 4 years. 4 years where we as a team are out there doing the hard slog, showing up at 6 a.m. in minus 20 degrees in Oslo, to talk to an investor about putting capital into our funds. It is much nicer to be having this conversation in Nairobi. It is much nicer to be having this conversation with the SNIT pension fund in Accra, with PIC in South Africa. We are starting to see some shifts, but it's not rapid enough. The fund model puts us in a situation where we find entrepreneurs and we say, trust us to put capital in your business. We're going to tie you up so that we are aligned. So if the company grows and you do well, we grow and we do well. But if the company doesn't grow, there are consequences on both sides. We're asking entrepreneurs to take this risk, but they take this risk in dollars because predominantly we are raising dollar-based funds for the continent. But these are local businesses that we're investing in, which are not, for the most part, charging in dollars. So they take that currency risk themselves. So if we talk about Nigeria, when we invest at a rate of 150 naira to the dollar, and within 3 years, that touches almost 400 naira to the dollar, we are expecting these businesses to have grown 8 to 9 times to give us a reasonable return. And that is not acceptable. This can be a path to actually destroying businesses. So a second thing that needs to change is we need to be more cognizant of the currency in which we're investing and the pressure that we're putting on the entrepreneurs. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the duration of time. While I said we work within a 5-year period to invest, the reality is when we make the investment, it can take up to 2 years, 3 years to find the right company, get to know the management team, get to understand what the concerns are, make the investment. And then a clock starts, which is really more aligned with a 3-year time frame, where we say, okay, over the next 3 years, we need to grow this business 6, 7, 8 times. And then we need an exit. And that's not happening. So as an industry, we have not been performing the way that we should have, or in fact could do. And that is because the time frame is also wrong. So a solution there, which will tie a number of these points together, is really for us to look at, again, that end goal. What are we trying to get to? If we're trying to solve for finding financing solutions, that means financing solutions for startups, for growth capital, and for significant expansion. There are different types of financing that are necessary. There's equity financing. There's access to debt. The guarantees are hugely helpful. Working capital. So if you look at this from an ecosystem perspective, there are lots of solutions we already have on the continent, but there are ways in which we need to be able to collaborate with each other better. And in doing so, we can actually continue to do as opposed to aim to do in the future if the following 15 things get aligned in the right way. If I look at things from a gender perspective, the numbers are dire. So it's estimated about 31% of businesses in Africa are owned by women. It's almost half of that in Southeast Asia. It's almost 1.5 times that in China. Within the private equity industry, we've just run the numbers in the last 6 months, and there are less than 10 of us as female partners of private equity firms. Where women are 30% or more of senior management in private equity firms across the emerging markets, what the studies have shown us is that the returns are higher by 20%. The performance of these funds is higher by 20%. It shows us that we invest twice as much in female-owned businesses. It shows in the lowest quartile of performance, we outperform by 50%. So even in terms of the perspective of selection of the transaction, selection of the businesses, we have an issue that needs to be addressed. We need that pipeline of women investors. Gender, inclusivity, growth, and the way that the capital comes together. These 4 things are intricately connected. As we move forward, there are a couple of things which I think we will need to continue to do, because we can't stop to get things right. We need to continue to finance companies. We need to continue to finance growth. And the matching mechanism right now is hugely problematic. You will find that there are those with capital who are saying it's hard to find investable deals. You'll find those who have found investable deals saying it's very difficult to find exits. You will find investors who put money into funds saying, but it's very hard to find the right fund manager. How do we get these all to align more? Technology is helping. It's helping in a big way. But we're still quite old-fashioned in the way that we do business. We need to sit across from entrepreneurs, understand what the problem has been, what the opportunities are, and where you think capital will help, and how it is you as an entrepreneur expect us as investors to help you get to that point. So if I look at an initiative like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think it makes a huge difference. The businesses which are perhaps more leery of what's to come tend to be businesses which have been in somewhat of a monopolistic situation. If you look at small and medium-sized enterprises, I've been looking at 2 transactions, one in Nigeria, one in East Africa, both in logistics businesses. They are very happy to see the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement come into force because their clients are small clients, are small businesses, some mid-sized businesses. And for them, knowing that it is easier to get through borders makes the biggest difference in the world. Right now, if you go into Lagos, what you will find is lines of trucks that have been waiting, some for months, to be cleared through to the port of Apapa. Think about everything that's sitting on the trucks and the loss of value there. If I talk about Botswana, entering via the border post from South Africa, there are queues of trucks. So there are elements of both the ease of doing trade and the movability of doing trade, which are going to be helped greatly by the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. There will be a greater formalization, I believe, of business that is going to happen as well, and that is also essential. This week, I was really heartened to see an announcement made by the governments of Ivory Coast and Ghana. Between the two of them, they account for 60% of the world's output of cocoa. And what they've said is they're halting production until they can agree a price floor that makes sense. It's 2019. Our ability to act as a bigger unit gives us negotiating power. 70% of the trade that we experience on the continent is extractive related. 70%. Our ability to negotiate is going to be what differentiates our success from our failure. Or, not our failure, but our success from our challenges as, the friction of doing better over time. And for that growth to stick. The same things, and at the end of this point, the same things that we sit and talk to investors about to convince them to put money into our funds. And predominantly for private equity, most of our capital, we're having this conversation with investors who don't know Africa. And it is painful. It is really painful to try and convince them of Africa. And that danger of telling the single story of you have completely misunderstood the continent. Things are not as bad as you think. The danger is the moment something happens, there's absolute panic. There's a balanced view that we need to give. These are the opportunities. These are some of the challenges, but we believe enough in the opportunities to do what it is that we're doing. It's an easier conversation to have with local investors because then they grill you on, but what are you doing in this sector? Why Kano versus Lagos? Well, Kano because it has one of the most established value chains around premium leather in the world and shea butter. So these are some of the things that we think about as we're considering where the opportunities are and where the challenges are.
Thank you very much, Geeta. Very important perspectives there. And I think, what really, stood out for me is I think we tend to, as Africans, always be looking to solutions from outside, and particularly when we're talking about capital, again, we're always looking at capital flowing from outside the continent. And so just hearing the immense potential that we have, as African states to finance, growth using capital from the continent, I think is something that's very important for us to take away. Now, I'm very, yes, please feel free to jump in, Ambassador Fatima.
Thank you so much. I just want to pick up on 3 points that were raised, particularly with your intervention, Geeta. Doctor, you mentioned, the issue of policy and the importance of implementation, but you also talked about, leadership and responsibility. And I'm always very careful about, despite the fact that I do work for the African Union, I'm always very careful about, this umbrella thing about Africa because of our different realities, whether it's on a national level or on a sub-regional level. Our histories are not the same, our leadership is not the same, and therefore we're at very different levels of development. However, there's certain issues that we can generalize, and this is, regarding what you were saying about the numbers, right? 170 billion required for infrastructure.
Annually, for the next 10 years.
Yeah. But at the same time, we're talking about capital investment, but capital externally. And going back to this issue about having uncomfortable conversations, what we're not talking about is, there is responsibility, right? Responsibility where we all know that Africa as a continent is very rich as far as resources are concerned. But the reality of it is 170 billion annually required vis-a-vis 150 billion that goes out of the continent in terms of initial financial flows, for example. When we're bleeding and when the money is being taken out illegally, and we go back to this issue about responsibility, we're not talking about how we can ensure that we put the right kind of policies in place globally, because there's a shared responsibility not only on the continent but also outside of the continent to block that bleeding, right? That's one. The second point is when it comes to our extractive industries. The percentage that is actually going out in terms of extraction vis-a-vis what's coming back as far as FDI or even aid for trade or any kind of capital is just a fraction of that. So the reality of it is we have the capacity internally as a continent to actually finance it, but the policies to be able to actually protect, right, to a certain extent, even if they're there on paper, in reality, one, are not being implemented for a wide number of reasons, which I won't go into. But unless we do have the capacity and the political will to actually ensure that these policies are put in place and that our external partners support us in being able to protect to a certain extent and take responsibility for this, we'll never get there, no matter what kind of initiatives we put in place. But I mean, that's open for debate. Thank you.
So can I just, first let me give you an anecdote. So a few years ago, there was a conference in Johannesburg of Africa finance ministers. And I happened to be invited for some reason or other. And as I listened, they started talking about illicit capital flows. And I, tongue-in-cheek, said this was a good thing because it showed me that Africans understood risk. I was almost lynched. But the point I was making, and the reason why this comes to mind, is the emphasis should not be on blocking or stopping. The emphasis should be on a positive incentive for capital to stay on the continent. I'm not going to keep my money on the continent when I know that year on year it's going to devalue because of what goes on. So if I'm risk managing, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to try and take it out. The second thing is, actually, I think whilst I hear you about our partners, the truth of the matter is that we are responsible. Because the people who lead that bleeding are our leaders. They are the ones who are stealing us blind in terms of the opportunity for you and I to externalize money is not actually easily available. But for them, literally when they fly, they just take money and it never gets accounted for. But I would just end up on a note about, let's create a positive incentive which demonstrates that we understand that there is a responsibility to protect value. If people keep their money, the value must not be undermined. If they get a return, they can get access to their money, not create negative incentives which then incentivize people to try and externalize the resource. Well, yeah, but you see, it's illicit because the laws say one thing, but the behavior creates an environment which says, take your money out. That's the point I'm making. Yeah?
Well, I think you're both making good points, and I think what it really means is that it's not one thing or the other. I think there really is, to all your different points, there is an ecosystem, there is an enabling environment, there's different pieces that have to come together for for capital to flow and stay on the market, on the continent, coming in, staying in, being sourced from each other. There is obviously an ecosystem that has to make all of that work.
But
now,
just before you move on, so
yes.
a related issue. Remember what the president said earlier on. The best resource that Africa has are the people.
Yes, of course.
We are training people for the world, not for the continent. Our young people, huge investment goes into education. The benefits go elsewhere because we are failing to create an environment that retains them. You can't force them to stay. They will absolutely go wherever the environment is more conducive for them to earn a living. So we need to just try to turn it around and say, we are responsible for creating an environment that reverses these flows, both brain drain and capital drain.
Absolutely, and I think on that note, it's very important for us at this point to invite the audience into this conversation. I think we've shared, from the experts up here, shared a lot of insights that I'm sure you all want to dive into. So we'll just open up to the floor. I'm sure there'll be mics going around. If you could just raise your hand, someone will come to you. Introduce yourself, make your question short. We know we're into your lunch hour, so let's be concise. And if you do have a particular panelist that you want to address your question to, please do say that. I'm obviously going to start with a lady.
I think this is working. Thank you for a lovely panel. My name is Dina Sharif. I'm from Egypt. I guess one of the few Eisenhower Fellows from North Africa, but Africa nonetheless. My question, I have two very simple questions. One is in a way following up on Geeta's point. I feel that often the discourse in Africa comes from a psychology of lacking. And it's often moving from a departure point of scarcity. What are our problems? What are we lacking? Where do we need to seek help from outside the boundaries of the continent? And I'd love to hear thoughts around what would happen in Africa if we shifted to a true culture of abundance and we really looked inwards to the assets that we have as opposed to simply what we're lacking? And my second question is perhaps a controversial one, but I'm Egyptian, so I feel I can ask it. It's a question about democracy and inclusion. So if we want to truly be competitive in global markets, to what extent is true democracy required as a political system to drive that forward, and to what extent is it not? Because democracy, where it may exist in some parts of Africa, doesn't exist in many parts of Africa.
Yes.
My name is Teddy Tatime. I'm from Ghana. I'm just happy that healthcare is beginning to become topical as the discussions go on. And the thing was, I've been involved in trying to trying to raise money for high-end healthcare where I am in Ghana. And
you didn't introduce yourself?
My name is Teddy Totime. I'm an Eisenhower Fellow from Ghana. So the thing is, it's all about money going where the risk is least. And what has happened as I've tried to raise money for high-end healthcare in my country has been the money just won't go where the risk is. But the thing is, looking forward into the future, if Africa is going to provide the workforce that the future of this world is going to have, if we don't have good healthcare, all this workforce is inexistent. And what Geeta was saying about the amount of investment, 3% going into 26% of the world disease burden, it's saddening. Now, what I want to just propose for the African Union is the fact that all this time, when it comes to important decisions for healthcare in Africa, they've been taken of the continent. All the response to our big healthcare issues in Africa have been negotiated, strategized, formulated outside the continent. I want to find out what the African Union can do to have a health strategy that is as, Africa-wide as the WHO office in Africa would have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the people behind me. I don't know if there's any question here. Okay, we've got one at the back, right next to you. Oh, okay, there's someone with the mic already. Okay, go ahead. This will be the last question that we'll take for this round and then have the panelists respond.
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Angawa from Kenya, and I'd like to commend all the panelists for very good insight that you've given to us. Just to start with Zubairu, Mr. Samaila, I'd like to thank you for your particular talk. You actually pointed out about investors who are not willing to invest in a country. But I would actually say that the reason why many investors would not want to invest in a country is specifically because of their judicial system. If your judicial system is slow and the process is cumbersome, then what would basically happen is that people will shy in wanting to invest in your particular country. I also noted that Kimball talked about there must be legal stability. How do you enforce across-border safety laws? You're not able to enforce these laws, you're not able to do anything. And I'd like to just commend Mr. Moyo when he talked about you must create an environmental enabling atmosphere for anything to actually occur. Just in this particular room, in April, we met as the African Association of Arbitrators, trying to get around the legal system in having what is known as alternative dispute resolutions. If we can invest in Africa in the alternative dispute resolution, where you can actually have your cases heard across borders, you can actually have your dispute resolved across different countries. So what has been happening in the past is that we'd have a seat in London. So every time the African countries have a dispute, they'll go to London, or they'll go to New York, or they'll go to another country outside, or we'll bring foreigners to come into Africa when Africa should be able to solve their own problems. So the Egyptian arbitrators and also the Kigali international arbitrators have come together and have formed the association, the African Association of Arbitrators. And I'd like to probably put that on the table and see if it is one of the feasible things that can unite Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think those are great questions. And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Nkosana. I know there were, a very interesting question on this mindset, scarcity versus abundance, and how do we shift to that? And also, looking at the role of democracy and inclusion in these key issues that we're discussing. So if you could speak to that, and Ambassador Amin, I think there was a very clear question put to the AU on, the healthcare and strategies that look at a continental level. And I think maybe, Geeta, it would be interesting also to share your perspectives. I mean, she's talking about the role of judicial and legal systems, in terms of attracting, capital investment, and also driving integration. And I'm sure this is something that, even Mr. Kimball, Samaila can jump in on, and just look at the role of, regulations, legal systems in ensuring that these things fall in place. So maybe if we could start with you, Nkosana.
So the psychology of poverty, I suppose, I think for me is linked to the paucity in quality of leadership. Our leaders, most of them, not all of them, don't actually understand the value of what this continent has. And the evidence is that in the deals they negotiate, they totally undersell us all along because they don't know the value, and if you don't know the value, how are you going to trade? International trade or trade period is about exchange of value. When I do a deal with you, we are exchanging value. For that to be done in a meaningful way, I need to know what I'm holding and what it's worth, and vice versa, you do the same. When you look at all the deals that Africa tends to do, time after time, what is demonstrated is that we do not know the value of what we're sitting on. So I would say that then leads, I mean, how often do you see our leaders, the people who represent us, going to other nations like beggars? They are psychologically socializing us as a people to behave like beggars. I mean, the president again pointed to this about the feeding programs and so on and so on. But a lot of his colleagues, our leaders, are at the forefront of doing that. They are always running around the world begging, instead of developing the product with which you can then exchange value. Yeah. Now, the controversial one on democracy, so let's do it empirically. I think we'd all agree that China is not democratic. I think we can all agree China is not democratic. But we can also agree that that has not stopped China developing a thriving economy. So I would tend to be a bit more relaxed. If I was getting good value from a benevolent dictator, I think I would sort of relegate the issue of democracy to some time in the future. No, okay? So let me give you another example, which is fascinating. A lot of you would know about Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew.
Exactly.
If you study carefully about Lee Kuan Yew's behavior, Lee Kuan Yew actually was not a Democrat in the sense that we try to sell it. We applaud Lee Kuan Yew retrospectively because of what he achieved. I dare say, at the risk of being politically incorrect, the debate going on about Rwanda, about human rights, I think actually, you know, in life we often have to choose just in terms of prioritization, because there isn't the possibility of doing everything you want all at the same time. You have to choose to prioritize and sequence. Again, I would rather, if I had 5 Paul Kagames on the continent, personally, I would say, you know what? It's a price I'm prepared to pay. That's the view I would take. Now, the healthcare decision question is an interesting one, because the country in which we are sitting today demonstrates that the world can do what it likes. You can't stop the world doing what it likes and making decisions and giving you an opinion. All it is an opinion. You still retain the responsibility of taking advice or doing something differently. Again, this country has got a thriving health system in spite of all the outsiders proffering different ways or options. So we cannot put the responsibility for what is going on the fact that outsiders are making these decisions. What are we doing? They are doing it because we are not doing anything. We are creating a vacuum almost of no activity. So the outside world then tries to intervene, thinking they are helping, because we are not doing what we should be doing.
Thank you. So I'll try and respond very briefly to Dina, but I think you've done that quite eloquently, and you're able to say more controversial things than I am. But you know, when you were asking the question, the first thing that came to my mind was, how do you define democracy, right? Because I think, generally speaking, many of the countries on the African continent are still teething. And if you define democracy as, you know, for the people, by the people, I think we're still a long way off. Many countries, many regions are still struggling, and we still need to grow into democracies that truly reflect the will of its people. And then I'll just endorse what you said without saying it. And then regarding the question by Dr. Teddy about, a continental approach to health. So from the perspective of an institution, the Commission itself has a number of policies and initiatives that are continentally focused. But the AU is, as a commission, is an institution, but the AU is made up of its member states at the end of the day. So it is for the member states to decide. And when you have a policy or policies at the continental level, the decisions are taken by member states, but it's for the member states to actually own it, to actually ratify locally, and to actually implement locally. So at the end of the day, the responsibility comes back to the member state and not the institution. And we go back to this whole discussion about responsibility, implementation, and so on and so forth.
I want to quickly intervene on the mindset topic. So I would share a story. Recently, I went on a Eurobond roadshow, trying to do any and all tender for my bonds maturing next year, and also trying to raise additional bonds to finance our business. So I met very interesting fund managers that I've never heard of, managing $1.7 trillion, managing $3 trillion, crazy numbers. And I was making inquiries, who are these people? Where did this money come from? So you'll be surprised to know that most of the money comes from here in Africa. Because we have all convinced ourselves that if our money is not outside the continent, it's not safe. We've all convinced ourselves that we must keep a portion of our foreign reserves in certain currencies. And it doesn't make any sense. That's why if you want to fundraise, you have to go to Oslo. It's the reason why I have to go to New York. I couldn't even find time to give Fatima a call because I was running from office to office. Some people were asking me, why did I take the job? So, you get all kinds of questions. So the point is, we have capital on the continent. And the capital is not just in the end results of the money, it's in the resources we have. If we take the view that we would not export raw materials anymore, but that will beneficiate those raw materials into processed goods that we can consume ourselves and also export, it will make a difference. If we take the view that we would use the resources that we have, for example, we're doing a peat-powered plant here in Rwanda. Everybody tells you shouldn't do that, it's not green, but the argument is, look, the alternative is to import heavy fuel oil or diesel, but the peat is here. Why won't you utilize it to generate power? So we must have those mindsets that, look, let's use what we have in the first instance. Let's substitute imports with what can be produced locally. Let's create jobs with our materials, not export the jobs outside the continent. We would have more capital because the more capital, the higher you go up the value chain, the more capital you create and the more money that you can save on the continent. So this is what we have to do. African governments need to change mindset. We need to understand that we should stop exporting raw materials. We should, to the extent possible, beneficiate locally, add value locally. We can create jobs that way. We can save more capital that way. And then we would not have to keep going outside the continent for capital.
I would like to comment on everything that my co-panelists have said, because I think I can add something to this. So first of all, let me address the health problem, because I think health is a very important thing. One problem is that, especially in developing countries, it's not politically or economically possible to properly value health. The delivery of health is not valued in the economic system. In developed countries, if people live longer, the insurance company is more profitable, or the pension fund doesn't have to pay off as soon. So institutional capital responds to changes in the health environment. But we don't have an economic response to improvement in health in Africa And if the economy of an African country isn't capable of paying for efficiently delivered health care because there's no way of getting the revenue for it that the government can justify, then you have a problem. Let me give you an example. Clean cooking, the thing I'm quite interested in, is regarded by the World Health Organization as the biggest killer in the developing world. 4 million people a year die from cooking with traditional fuels. More than HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria kill every year. So it's the biggest killer. But it only gets $30 million a year of direct support. HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria get 3,000 times as much solution funding. So why? Because they better marketing. So just because a problem exists doesn't mean that people do anything about it. The lost value of human capital from fuel gathering by you women, your women colleagues, is probably 2% lost GDP value. If you just take the number of hours of girl, children, and women gathering fuel, walking out, walking back, carrying 50 kilos of wood, then cooking, compared to using electricity or bottled gas, the lost labor time and education time has a value at conservative valuations of 2% of your GDP, and compounded forever if you just keep doing the traditional thing. So, but you don't value that in your economy. Who will pay for that health? Who will pay for that health? Other problems are not paid for. Now, coming to the issue of currency, because national currencies are small in depth, it's hard to create Africa-wide initiatives for large projects. So actually, there is a need for Africa to develop a stable, internationally respected currency which doesn't reflect the limited supply and risks of individual countries. That's why the euro strengthened Europe, because it was a universal currency that had critical mass to be used globally in competition with the dollar or now the renminbi. So you have to, that's going to be one of those issues of international cooperation that you're going to have to, I would think about. Now, I'm not a currency economist. I'm not a macroeconomist by nature. But as a businessman, I would tell you that currency risk, especially for things that have to be imported, energy is a dollar business. So all these, Ghana, for instance, Ghana just signed a long-term power contract for a gas-powered plant, GE's involved, starting off with LPG and then switching to LNG. All of those are imported fuels, expensive, using imported turbines. So they've just locked in 20 years of a need for dollars, okay? So import substitution and use of domestically produced resources is very important. Coming to the democracy issue, I just called to your attention a well-known Princeton political economist named Daniel Bell, not the famous Harvard Daniel Bell, but a new Daniel Bell, wrote a book comparing the practical results for citizens of China from their government versus practical results for the citizens of the United States, and how from the US form of government and how those leaders are selected. And he comes up with a conclusion measured across the usual kinds of metrics of World Bank, mortality, educational level, progress. He says the Chinese government does a better job. So that's an interesting comment on American-style democracy. And I'm an American citizen, so I say, oh my, maybe there are things that we have to fix. But let me come back to the Africa issues. Because the subject of this conference is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, all the national problems that we talk about here need to be also refracted through the lens of its implications for a continent. So vastly differing rates of development and vastly differing rates of development in specific sectors make it difficult to achieve coordination step by step in a sector. So the challenge I would pose as an outsider to all of you Africans is, what are you going to ask your leaders, wise leaders or not wise leaders, what are you going to ask them to do which will be lasting in terms of structural change and intergovernmental agreements which would allow a continental vision to actually take place? And how do you achieve that step by step? Right now you're talking, but as you yourself, Doctor, have said, talking is not enough. Doing is what matters. So what is the way in which all of you leaders can get the government heads of state to cooperate enough and across all parties, because governments change and you need durability across administration. So these are the questions I flip out to you. Value the problems properly by your economies, such as health. Have agreements which can withstand change in politics, and think in terms of what you need as a continent, something like a currency or something like that, to be able to be a bloc which will have negotiating power, which is what we were discussing here. I mean, you need to have negotiating power. So, and yet you're competitors. So how can competitors, individual countries, cooperate? Co-opetition. How do you manage the issue of co-opetition as a continent? I'll stop.
Let me ask you a question. Which country, and this is a question to the audience actually, which country do you think faces the following three things? Number one, they have not ratified in their constitution the right of equal rights from a gender perspective. It is the only country in the world which has not signed the International Convention on Children's Rights. And 40% of the population will be pushed into poverty if they have an unexpected bill of $400.
United States.
It is the USA. Yeah. More money, more problems, hey? But the point that I'm trying to bring here is we are all evolving. There are solutions which were put in place 60 years ago which have allowed us to do what we're doing now. There are solutions that were put in place 5 years ago which allow us to push forward. I looked at a hospital deal in Ethiopia about 6 years ago. And I walked into the hospital and the doc told me, you know why there's a ramp between the first and the third floor? Electricity, I can't count on it. I take the gurneys up because that's where my operating theater is. A common problem we have on the continent, we can't trust power supplies. So you then have the emergency room right next door to where patients are coming in to check in. Bad idea. You need to actually have them far apart. So he said, I built a ramp, and that solves my problem. So as I walked through the hospital with him, he told me you'll find Korean doctors in there. I made a joke and I said, North or South Korean? He said, both. Both. Because, unfortunately, a lot of my patients who come to me here in Ethiopia, who are Ethiopian, feel they will get a better quality of service if it is a non-Ethiopian doctor. So I have to actually have non-Ethiopian doctors in. The South Korean embassy came and asked me, would you like some doctors? I said, yes. Then one day the North Korean embassy came and knocked on the door and said, would you like some doctors? I said, yes. So that's how I ended up with North Korean doctors and South Korean doctors. You go into the NHS in London, and that's where you see our healthcare workers from Africa. Mm-hmm. Our nurses, our doctors. And you know, I was part of the team. In 2007, 2008, I was finishing a graduate degree on the use of private equity as an instrument of development in Africa. Because fundamentally, I believe capital makes a difference. It allows us to build long-term resilience and institutionalize our entities. And I was tempted to drop out of the program to become part of the founding team of what we created, being the first healthcare fund, private sector healthcare fund for Africa. We raised $105 million for that fund. It also happened to be the world's first base of the pyramid fund. So we were very clearly articulating a quality of investment beyond a financial return. We wanted both. And through that fund, we invested in 2 hospitals in Ghana. The first one, C&J Medicare, Dr. Joyce Jabati. We used our capital, and these were roughly $3 to $5 million investments, right? We used that capital to put in new diagnostic equipment. I walked into the hospital when the diagnostic equipment was being installed, and I found a Nigerian GE technician there. So I said, oh, okay, how long have you been living here in Accra? And he said, I don't. There's insufficient diagnostic equipment here in the entire country for GE to have even one technician in Accra, right? So again, from the healthcare perspective, we're grateful that the head of the WHO now is African, Dr. Tedros, and he fights hard for Africa. I was at the WHO annual meetings 2 weeks ago and had 5 sessions with African leaders. There was one session where there were 10 African ministers of health, where the Egyptian Minister of Health, Dina, you'll be happy to hear, was talking to us about some great programs they put in place, very cost efficient, to address hepatitis. They pulled in the multinationals as they needed to. We've got the Africa CDC, Dr. John, who's based in Addis. So taking accountability and having that accountability on the continent. You know, Kasana, the point you raise about aid, I have a view on that. Every single one of us in this room is extremely privileged to be where we are. How many of us have need for that aid directly? I would posit that there's a big swath of our continent who will tell you we need that aid. So our responsibility, I feel, is building that pathway to no longer needing that aid. And from a financing perspective, one of the things that I firmly believe in is the quality of capital that is coming to finance and invest in businesses in Africa. It's changing. The Sustainable Development Goals is helping to change that. We call it impact investing. We're saying investors who are saying, I don't just want a financial return. I want a solid financial return, but I want certain development outcomes as well. That allows us to build a more resilient economy. And I believe in that. I am glad I'm having conversations with UN agencies who are saying we are looking to put capital to work through the private sector as opposed to just programmatically deploy this capital to never be returned. This is what we call blending, right? And we're seeing more and more of this happening. And I think that's the future. If I think about private equity in Africa, a fallacy was our entire industry exists because of private sector development. It is development finance institutions who created the entire PE industry in Africa. Little known fact, actually, this was the same initiative that started the entire private equity industry in the UK after World War II, when they realized that the SME space is what was going to drive development. So the Macmillan Gap report came out and 3i was created to provide private sector development in the UK. Nobody today who looks at 3i, one of the largest PE firms, realizes it started with a mandate to do development in the UK. We have that same mandate here in Africa. But we are not going to go from the DFIs to raising capital from pension funds who are sitting in the Midwest in the US, because they look at headline risk. They read a newspaper article about Ebola and call and say, are you investing in Kenya? And then, you know, some of us are forced to sometimes get a bit frustrated and say, well, you've had an incident of Ebola on your shores, Kenya has not. So I'm actually a little bit more afraid about coming to the US than I am about going to Kenya. I believe that what will bridge that capital need is the conscientious capital which we need to attract. It is defining the terms on which we want that capital. And Rwanda is a great example of that. We heard the president today. But let's also acknowledge the fact that a fairly significant part of the government's expenditure in this country is currently still financed by aid. But the president is setting the tone to say, I want to wean this country off of that. So I'm accepting this on these terms. And we need to get better about that from the private sector as well as we attract capital.
But sorry,
Thank you
this
very
is an important issue.
We are running out of time, Doctor.
You can only say, I want something on these terms if you are credible. Right. Only if you are credible.
Correct.
If you've got no credibility, you've got no right to put down terms on the table.
Kasana, I agree with you. Yeah. But we've raised $17.8 billion between 2013 and 2018.
Yeah.
And to recognize the heterogeneity of the region, it means we also need to recognize that credibility and lack thereof is not always the problem. We have it in different ways. We are still finding capital and we are still finding opportunities, right? And I think the people within this room are making that difference, whether it is within a particular country, a company, private sector, public sector, or the third sector.
Yeah, but the need
We'll
is...
have a coffee.
Yes, we'll take this. I mean, this conversation could go on and on, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. We're not able to take any more questions. But I would just like, all, ladies, gentlemen, just give a huge round of applause to the panelists. I think they've brought very, very rich perspectives. And in particular, I want to thank you, Mr. Samaila, Zubairu, and the Africa Finance Corporation for really making sure that this conversation happens. So thank you once again. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you very much, Louise. Please join me in giving them another round of applause. To the moderator and the speakers, it was very engaging. You can take to your seats as I just make a couple of announcements. Yes, just a few announcements. So lunch is right next door, right where we had coffee. And as you can see, these conversations have been really sweet, but they've also taken time, and we're really running late on the program. So I'd encourage us to have just a short lunch. Is everyone okay with that? Can we do 30 minutes for lunch? We're literally next door, I mean, so that we can have all the 2 remaining panels take place today. And very exciting stuff. Immediately after the panels, we go straight into a cocktail. In this vicinity, and then we're going to also have the gala dinner. So let's just not take too long having lunch. We're just going. We will make up for that during the gala dinner as well as the cocktail. So if I could have you move to the next room, 30 minutes, so we can keep time and keep the second 2 panels for the afternoon. Thank you.